Pregnant pause. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation to come. The Makata Institute is visible to me, and I've been learning and benefiting from learning more about what's happening here. And I also have had a great opportunity just in the first 12 hours, I guess, that I've been here to reconnect with some colleagues that I've known for some time, as well as to make new acquaintances. And I look forward to continuing and deepening these relationships in areas that we share interests in. Is Ingrid still here? Yeah, maybe stepped out. That was the best warm-up I have ever had for doing one of these sorts of talks, which typically are quite sturgid and staid and serious and scientific. I think that this is something I would like to incorporate into my repertoire from here on. It was lovely. So please pass along my sincere thanks to her for this. So there's a slight amendment to the title of this presentation. It is now beginning with morphologies of action. And this idea of morphology is something that, of course, comes from linguistics, which means the shape or form. Okay? So morphologies of communicative action, agency, or the kinds of ways in which people orient to activity in the world, and the rewilding of education. I'll talk about a number of areas that articulate with these themes across 4 component parts of the presentation. The first is to argue and demonstrate, in fact, it's not particularly debatable, that humans and technologies have been enmeshed with each other in a co-evolutionary dynamic for 2.5 million years minimally. I will begin 2.5 million years ago in this presentation. So please bear with me. We will get to contemporary technologies very shortly. In the contemporary era, we both have many virtues and capacities for transforming activity and action with technology, but we also have many problems that have arisen with the advent of digital media, mobile media, et cetera. And I want to briefly mention that before talking about a more or less 20-year arc of academic inquiry that looks at both learning in classrooms, but also learning in the wild, which here I simply define, operationalize, as learning that happens outside of formal institutional contexts, to see what we can learn to create better ecological validity between what happens in institutional learning spaces like classrooms and the real-world applications for what happens in classrooms. Very few learners of any subject, certainly languages, practice studying in classrooms to be good at practicing studying in classrooms. Does this make sense? Yeah. So we need to think about this ecological validity between what we do and the arenas of human activity outside of institutions like universities and schools. So I'll talk about mediation, the cultures of use, all tools from brick and mortar, concrete material tools to digital technologies and even human language. All tools are cultural tools, and I'll talk about that in part 2 of the presentation. And then at the end, I'll sort of wind together this discussion of mediation and of learning in the wild to talk about an idea that actually originates in Europe. You may or may not be familiar with the rewilding efforts in Europe, which is an ecological movement and effort. But I'll talk about rewilding language learning and education from the position of what we've learned outside of traditional educational environments. Okay. I think this might work. So development, the long view, the extremely long view of the co-evolutionary dynamic between humans and technologies. Now, you would all be very familiar with the fact that most of our research is in the very top quadrant here, what's called within the Vygotskian developmental framework anyway, microgenesis, what you learn in a week, in a month, maybe even in an hour or a few minutes, the course of a semester, the course of a 4-year or 5-year degree program, right? But we also have ontogenesis, the development of individual organisms, human beings in this case, across the lifespan. The ontogenesis of an individual is always and everywhere embedded in the sociocultural development across generations, maybe even millennia, of the kinds of cultures that we all exist in. None of us created the German language or the English language, a very odd, unsophisticated American variant of which I'm using now. We inherited these cognitive resources, these communicative resources to do the work of complex social organization, loving and caring for each other, et cetera. Now, the sociocultural processes that inform ontogenesis and microgenesis are also sitting atop of another dimension, which is the phylogenesis of our species, which goes back, as I mentioned, quite a while. So since the advent of what became modern humans, or Homo sapiens, we've had this very complex dynamic of the cultural organization of the development of resources through which we do what we do as people: communicate, build, and transform aspects of our environment. And this is something that I will illustrate, and there are many examples actually, through one very concrete anatomical argument, which is the development of the human hand. If you go back to Homo erectus 2.5 million years ago, all the way up to about 1 million years ago, a little more, and then you overlap with, Homo habilis, and then you overlap with Homo erectus, you see very different kinds of tool development. So the Oldowan development, which is the oldest known stone tools of hominids, led to the development of the Acheulean industry. And you see those on your right, which are these shaped bifacial tools for cutting and for doing more fine work. Now, as this change in our development of tools evolved, so did our human bodies. So this idea of the hand having this third metacarpal attached to the wrist by what's called a styloid process — there will be no quiz, by the way, after this presentation on this terminology — allowed for two kinds of grip: a precision grip and a strength or power grip. And it increased our capacity to produce these tools. And as you can see, quoted by Wardenall, an increased reliance on manipulatory behaviors indicated in the archaeological record based on the tools selected for the modern human hand early in the evolution of the genus Homo. And here you have the styloid process showing this dynamic. Now, this might seem like a trivial thing, but the idea of the tools that we use actually coming to inform the anatomy of our bodies suggests this coevolutionary dynamic between our development phylogenetically as a species and our incorporation and use of tools. There is this mutual relationship. Okay, so we know now, by the way, we're moving from 2.5 million years ago to the present, okay? So there's a time warp moment. And we know that technologies have made tremendous activities possible that weren't available before. These ideas of transnational engagement, so just people keeping in communication with diaspora communities or family members all over the world, but also applied to education, online intercultural exchange or virtual exchange. For example, getting communities of people who want to learn each other's languages together via some sort of synchronous or asynchronous internet communication or digital modality, right? We know that through social media in particular, and we got a glimpse back to MySpace. There was also another environment that preceded Facebook called Friendster, which many of you probably don't remember. But this way in which the social organization of identity production and maintenance, social relation maintenance, is occurring in both online and offline settings, and in certain parts of our online environments overlap in a Venn diagram form with what's happening offline, our brick and mortar realities with people. We know that there's been this massive increase. Fandom has always existed, people liking something, people being enthusiasts of a particular topic, or in this case, in the present era, a media, a television program, a book series, Harry Potter, for example. We know that now through digital mediation, fandom is massive, and you have this huge amplification of what's happening in terms of breadth and reach, but you also have different things going on that were not possible before, like a fan sharing art or fan fiction or something related to this media that they love so much, but then instead of doing it for themselves or their immediate small spatially local community, they have the capacity to distribute this globally. It may not be seen by anyone, but the capacity for distributing it is there. Multimodal expression, and Gunter Kress and many language theorists have talked about this in great detail. The movement from the logic of time, because when I'm speaking, for example, I start with a sentence initial or a clause initial component, and I move through toward the end, and it's actually emplaced in time. Of course, when you get widespread things like literacy and multimodal expression, so pictures and images and things like this coupled with literacy, you move from a logic that's restricted to time to a logic that includes space. And there's been quite a lot of theorization there. I'll mention only briefly aided and augmentative technologies. I don't know how many of you work with populations that have perhaps speech pathologies or other constraints on their capacity to fully participate in contemporary society, schooling, et cetera. But aided and augmentative technologies have been tremendously helpful in actually allowing portions of the population who might not be able to do full participation to do so. And the last is this thing that's very close to education, adaptive learning, learning analytics, learning management systems that many universities use. What is used here, by the way, in Cologne? Blackboard or a Moodle or Canvas? Yep. So, all these sorts of things have also been very interesting. So adaptive learning in particular, these larger interventions that are possible digitally are actually happening, of course, as you would probably well know, right here in Germany. My colleague and a friend, Detmar Mira, from Tübingen, has been working on this sort of broad digital intervention where you take what used to be a analog workbook, you put it online, you include kinds of scaffolding and feedback critical to the language learning process into the digital environment, and you actually see how it develops. And this is, of course, as an intervention project, an iterative cycle. So you begin with something, and then you see how it works. You look at what's called in the data field, the data exhaust coming out of this environment, and you can actually see what students are doing. What are they not doing? What resources are being taken advantage of? Or what resources that are being taken advantage of by a subset of the population could be better used or universalized across the platform because its developmental effects are so great and it's being underutilized by certain individuals for whatever reason. So there are really a lot of interesting things happening in this space. And I was very pleased. This is in the Annual Review of Applied Linguistics, which is a very important journal in the field. So I was very pleased to see this. We also know that, of course, technology is breaking parts of what we used to call civil discourse. I'm not sure that exists anymore, this idea of non-trolly kinds of discourse domains. And civil discourse, of course, is the bedrock, the infrastructure upon which participatory democracy functions. So we are at this moment where, whether it's Cambridge Analytica or all of the data leaks that have happened with other kinds of Facebook personal information, or the fact that Facebook is engineering conditions by removing certain words from feeds to see if click or a browser behavior shifts, right? I mean, there are ways in which this is an era fraught with peril. And we also, of course, I talked about morphologies of action. And a quick example, if you're on the sand, on the beach with your kids or your family or friends, and you're digging to make a sandcastle, you move like this typically, right? Yeah? What if you had a little trowel or a shovel? How would your body move? You still going to take a shovel and go like this? You can't. You literally have to move your body in a different way, right? Like this with a shovel or a trowel. And of course, if you need to move a lot of dirt, you probably sit in a bulldozer and you just move a little jog lever, yeah? So the relationship is here. Technologies actually change not just the ways in which we think, communicate, interact, socialize, make decisions, make poor decisions sometimes if you look at the democratic process recently unfolding in the United States. But it also affects the body, right? How many of you have seen this? This was impossible before 2008. This would not have been possible for people to be walking along like this in 2008. That was, by the way, the advent of the smartphone, right? You see these kinds of, I should have done the thing where, okay, what am I doing now? And every single one of you would have said, he's checking his phone. right? So this is something that we see a lot. We see simo-solo activity. It could be that they're sharing the latest thing that's happening on TikTok, for example, or whatever, but they are also in their separate semiospheres communicating with non-co-present partners in a way that seems to supersede the opportunity to engage in the primordial condition of face-to-face interaction that our species, phylogenetically, is designed for. So the cognitive and communication and psychological implications of these sorts of activities, let alone the neck problems, chiropractors, any chiropractors in the room, massage therapists, I think you're going to be doing extremely well with this emerging generation of people. So I went back 10 years. Before this talk, I thought I really want to do just a little piece before I talk about all the wonderful things happening with technology. So this is not a new phenomenon. Our cluttered minds was the headline here in the New York Times. Hooked on gadgets and paying a mental price, also 2010. Digital detox, right? How do you get yourself off your devices, especially with the ubiquity of, for example, these things that I even have in my pocket while I'm presenting to you now. We also have much more draconian and serious issues to address through what's called surveillance capitalism. And if you want a read that will make you very uncomfortable, you could look at Shoshana Zuboff's recent book, 2019, Harvard Business School professor emeritus. It's a very important book. And the idea of thinking about what she calls epistemic inequality, right? The abyss, the gap, the space between what we know and what is known about us. Okay? This is really, as the joke goes, this is not her line, this is mine. If you're not paying for the product, you are the product, right? So this idea of a power shift in the 20th century from ownership of means of production to ownership of the production of meaning. And again, if you think about who's controlling your news feed, what algorithms are feeding you particular information, whose feeds or whose news sources are you gaining ready access to or even being pushed, and what are you being precluded from? Clearly, we still have agency in this space. But increasingly, information is perspectived and it is embedded in ways that mystify that relationship between ideological orientation and the quote-unquote information or data being displayed. Right? This makes our jobs as educators all the more important because we must think about critically producing people who are conscious and aware of the perspectival nature of these tools. Okay, so I'll just end this little section with a quote from Roy P., a scholar I'm guessing you do not know, but he was very prominent in the distributed cognition literature. And this I chose because it's from 1985, just at the advent of technologies coming into schools. He calls these digital technologies cognitive technologies, by the way, because the cognitive technologies we invent serve as instruments of cultural redefinition, shaping who we are by changing, not just amplifying what we do. Defining educational values becomes a foreground issue. And because so much of what happens in digital media is semiotic, is language-based, we are in a particularly important position in society and in institutions to contribute to these discussions about the discursive and linguistically mediated production of ideological and informational awareness that subsequently come to inform at least what we hope will be the continuation of a participatory democratic system. So I'll now talk about this idea that all tools are cultural tools. And by culture, obviously I'm talking about the processes in real time of the use or engagement with kinds of tools that are particular across populations, right? That's what I'm describing as culture. This is an old idea, but it bears repeating. Nothing we do is unmediated. So if you want to communicate, so the subject, you, for example, the object of your activity is communication. You can use American Sign Language. You can use one of the many languages that we have in Europe, for example. You can also communicate in writing. right? And all of these are different mediational means or affordances, yeah? And the idea in this framework is it's not just about mediation in terms of how you get things done. It's the way in which the mediational means, languages or physical tools, right? Digging versus digging. Literally, your body is shifting its morphology of action to accommodate and better utilize the tool. So this is the case with digital technologies. It's the case with linguistic relativism, for example, when you think about the ways in which different languages organize and prefigure kinds of understanding and apperception in the world, right? This is a very important point. So human activity is always and everywhere mediated by in some way. Tools shape how that action is happening, and by shaping external action, certain kinds of cognitive or internal dynamics are also affected. I'm not going to, the project that I'm going to report on uses this cultural historical activity theory model, but it's obvious that people, individuals doing something through mediation are also embedded in communities. The divisions of labor structure those communities. Students and professors, for example, do very different things. So that would be an example of division of labor. And that there are rules that govern these sorts of interactions. And oftentimes there are multiple systems of culturally organized activity in interface with each other. All right? So the project that I'm going to mention very briefly has to do with online intercultural exchange. This was an early project that began in 2000 and went to 2004, an externally grant-funded project where we were trying to figure out better ways to educate American students by interacting with colleagues, students in the EU, particularly Germany, France, and Spain, and they were learners of German, French, and Spanish. And the rationale for this is Mark Twain want to remind us. Mark Twain is an American humorist who lived a century ago, but he is noted as having said, among many other pithy things, "I was greatly discouraged when upon arriving in France, I found no intermediate French speakers there." And of course, you don't find intermediate French speakers in France, right? I mean, you might if you really looked. But I mean, everyone there is a speaker of the language. So the idea of using this online intercultural exchange format to get people together is a great idea. So here is something that happened in one of these projects. I'm in the lab. I'll go back just a little bit. I'm in the lab, and the students in the US are interacting with students, in this case in France, all right? And they're using asynchronous tools like email, as well as synchronous chat and video conferencing tools, all right? These are all required. You have to write emails and get responses. You have to engage in synchronous chat, et cetera. So Kate says about her French key pal, "I love Francois. He's terrific. I would talk to him like doing the whole synchronous thing, like on instant messenger. I would talk to him all the time. I just don't like writing emails," right? I'm listening to this as they're in the lab actually communicating with Francois. Steph says, "I would talk to him like if he were on IM," this is back in the day, right? 2002, actually. "I'd talk to him all the time. He's a sweetie." Kate says, "Yeah, he's so cute. I love him. Francois is the best person ever." We have a Francois love fest here, right? It's clear. And I'm listening to them. They've been failing the course because they're not emailing Francois. They will not send an email. And I'm like, "So can't you follow up with email? Obviously, there's a lot of infatuation here." She goes like, "Yeah, but I hate writing email," line 5. Line 6, and so I'm sort of sitting here like, who doesn't want to send an email? My goodness. And I said, "Really? So the email exchanges are just not as dynamic?" Or she's like, Steph says, "No, they're not." Grace. But I think it's also because like we communicate with a lot of people now through instant messaging, so that's how I talk to all my friends. And Steph says, "And here," and Grace says, "Well, we don't send emails back and forth to each other to catch up. Like we just talk, which using synchronous, like texting and things like this. It's like, yeah, it's just like what we do." And I'm still sitting there dumbfounded, and I'm like, "So you don't use email, right? I mean, and she said, "Almost never. I use it for teachers and stuff." Grace says, "Yeah, teachers, yeah. Or my mom." Okay? So here's this project, which is brilliant in its conception. Obviously, it predated me, right? The idea of pen pals. I mean, this is such an old idea, right? Do you want to learn language? Why don't you develop an age-peer relationship with someone you want to get your groove on with and use the language to do it, and you're going to be motivated, and it's going to be fantastic. And then you have a student saying, I love this guy, won't send email. And so none of us could really figure this out. So within this activity theoretical framework, we began thinking about tools as cultural tools, okay? So there was this whole potential flirtation thing. I mean, there had been a lot of rather obvious emotional resonance between particularly these three females and Francois, lucky man he is, and email was the wrong tool for doing this work, right? So how I described this in the 2003 article is we had the right job, getting young people together and communicating so that they wouldn't only hear the teacher or only deal with workbooks and the professor and these sorts of things. Get students using a language. But email, it turns out, was a culturally specific tool suited to vertical communication across power lines and generation lines, but not for interpersonal age-peer relationship building, right? And this idea is called the cultures of use. All tools have a particular cultures of use, and this framework can really help us think about the ways in which certain tools may preclude certain kinds of activity that we want, and they may also amplify or empower or enable. So, for example, one of the things we did after this project is we started using vernacular tools. WhatsApp, in the present era, tools that students already use. And what we found, not surprisingly, is a massive increase in participation, in engagement, in doing communicative exchanges in the target language outside of normal class or assignment contexts, because it's something that they were simply accustomed to doing, and they just were trying to figure out how to do it in another language. So just as languages, cultures, social practices vary across communities, so too do the cultures of use of internet or other digital tools potentially vary across communities. So this is a really interesting intercultural exploration space, this idea of tools and tool mediation. Now, in Germany in particular, I had some contestation of this cultures of use idea from colleagues in Germany who said, well, wait a minute, my students use email just fine. They have no problem using email for age-peer relationship building and maintenance. And I said, exactly. That's the point, that the young people in Germany who I think came to the digital era a little bit later than kids in the US had not necessarily migrated on to other tools. They were using email quite a bit. That is the culture of use of email for the participants that you're talking about who have no problem doing age-peer relationship building with email. That is the culture of use of email for that German population you're talking about. For the American students, it was quite different. So I followed up on this a couple of times, and I asked in 2006, what about using email with friends that are living far away? And I got, again, these culture of use variants, right? So here's one person who said, you know what? I didn't used to use email, and then the quotation here, but there's more sentimentality to email than instant messaging. Going back to the epistolary conventions of the Victorian era and love letters to each other, right? And I was like, oh, you're making me so happy, you know? I was so excited by this. And then you have another student, same focus group. So they're co-present, hearing what each other's saying. And he says, sometimes it's hard to think of something to fill up a whole email. Like, they send a really long one or something. My ex-girlfriend used to say, why don't you just send email? And I'm like, yeah, why don't I just kill myself? So this is actually a really powerful indication that for some students, the internet communication tool chosen will have a radical effect on the kinds of interactions that play out or don't play out. Okay. It doesn't stop. In 2015, I was holding forth in a venue not unlike this, and I said, it was actually a seminar class, and I said, finally, we have a transgenerational tool that does all of the work for, teens as well as octogenarians. And a student in my class put his hand up, 19 years old, and he says, oh yeah, Facebook. I have Facebook friends in two categories. One for my real friends and a very large group for everyone else, like people in their 20s, parents, teachers, and family. I call the big group old people. So you people in your 20s, you are now way over. Okay, so this, if you're interested, I've written about all this stuff, of course. So you're welcome to visit this, where I talk about cultures of use and the morphologies of communicative action associated with tools, right? So when we're thinking about internet communication tools, when we're thinking about constructing environments that involve digital mediation, the onus, the responsibility is on us to be making these decisions in informed ways that articulate with the kinds of communicative action that we want, that we hope will enhance learning outcomes. Okay. So one way to think about this is a metaphor. For those of you who are architects, you might be familiar with this. Desire lines, also called desire path game trail. So the design is the syllabus and the use of your learning management tool and making students use email and all of these things. And then you have the user experience, what students actually do. So I'm quite interested in attending to the game trails, the desire lines, which is a lovely expression, right? So people want to get, does this work, pointer? People want to get over there, and of course a lot of people walk up and you can see the paved road goes like this. But a lot of people just make their own path, right? So if we want to do something like language beyond learning the morphosyntax of whatever the language is, or you learn the first, most frequent 1,000 words of fill in the blank Spanish or what have you, we need to think about context through which that language gains a viable life. And I think this idea of looking at traced or lived experience is a fascinating one. So this idea compelled me to run away from the classroom. I still work in the classroom a lot, and look at what's happening outside of classroom spaces. I will ask a question here. Artificial intelligence researcher Rodney Brooks, has anyone ever seen those Roomba, those automatic vacuum cleaners? He invented that. So in this metaphor of thinking about how to explore learning in the wild, right? I became compelled by this researcher's work, because here's what he had to say. You know, and I won't go into like deep learning and machine learning and all of this kind of thing, separate talk, bless you. But there's this relationship between trying to build models of something, which was what we do in education. We try and build a model of the knowledge or the epistemics that subsequently we want people to be able to utilize in another context or environment, right? So Rodney Brooks says, representations and models of the world simply get in the way. It turns out to be better to use the world as its own model. The world as its own model. Which means, for educators, thinking about what happens in these desire paths, what have you, and thinking about ways to mediate what's going on in this space. Now, obviously, there's a tremendous amount of plurilinguality in a variety of contexts. Here's an example from Facebook. Dejan Ivkovic and I did quite a bit of work. Makes you want to throw open your mouth just a tiny bit sometimes when you read the comments fields hanging off the Eurovision Song Contest on YouTube. But the linguistic mastery and deftness is incredible, looking at the ways in which multiple languages are used. It's a highly plurilingual environment, and people will use a variety of linguistic resources to sculpt these kind of nation-state identity formations, and it's fascinating. So I've looked at environments like this. Fan fiction, or fandom more broadly, has been massively interesting. If you want students to end up producing beautiful expository, really, or narrative prose, have them find a media that they care about and then do writing based on that figured world, right? Many of us cannot write well enough to create a believable figured world, but we can contribute by inserting ourselves in the storyline, or bringing up issues like teen pregnancy and hating your parents in a Harry Potter fan fiction, right? Which is not in the original, of course. And there's all kinds of incredible work, particularly I'll mention Rebecca Black and Sirpa Leppänen, and then pedagogical orientations to this are happening a lot with Shannon Sauro, who's a frequent collaborator. Massively multiplayer online games. Obviously, I've written a bunch of stuff in this space, and I'll talk about that as one of my case studies. Some of you may be troubled by your children's addiction to Fortnite. It's a very interesting environment, this multiplayer cooperative sandbox, also first-person shooter game. And I have a fascinating project developing in this space. To take one example, online gaming in particular has been deeply stigmatized, sometimes for very good reasons, mind you. But I kept getting, did the typical thing. I started playing World of Warcraft, which was the most popular multiplayer game ever, right? Started playing, wrote an article, quit playing. Then all my graduate students guilted me into coming back and playing. So it's like, you can't do that. You're like the anthropologist who parachutes in, looks at the village, walks away after, and writes a book. And that's totally not cool. So I went back and spent like 2,000 hours playing the game. And I was really blown away by the complexity. And I'd mentioned that. I was like, wow, it's actually a really complex environment with all types of literary texts that are embedded in the game and all that. And people would just be like, no, that's not possible. It's a stupid online game. So there's a whole bunch of research on gaming, which I'm not going to discuss. The slide deck, by the way, is available to you. I've left it with Pascal. So you don't have to worry about writing down references or any of that. So I'm just going to, oh, by the way, gaming. So these are my kids. This is what's called epic win face. Have you heard of this in the social psychology literature? They're just looking for a quest giver. They're just looking for it. So this is like a basic task, but Benicio's 4 and his sister is 6, all right? Isabella's 6. And, they're like, So what if we had that kind of emotional response in our classrooms? Right? Think about it. Think about generating that kind of limbic engagement. We all know cognition is not stuck in the brain. Cognition is embodied. And the limbic system is tremendously important. Emotionality. Sorry if that was a little less clear. Okay, enough of my kids. World of Warcraft, it's a massive three-dimensionally rendered space where you play in avatar format. That's all you need to know. What I really want to answer is this question, so what's going on in this space? Everyone knows if you want to learn a language, you have to have good input. You have to have good language. You must. It's an important part of second language acquisition. Everyone knows this. Without good language or being exposed to good language, it's going to be really hard or impossible to learn. So you also need opportunities for meaningful communicative engagement. I know these are super basic, but distributions, frequencies, functions, forms, their salience, all of this is super important. And there's lots of serious science SLA that backs this up. So we asked 2 simple questions. It's an empirical question, whether these are interesting or useful developmental environments. What is the linguistic complexity of high-frequency World of Warcraft-associated texts? And are players just in the game, or are they also using things outside of the game, right? External websites, et cetera. We wrote this up, by the way. It's been written up in a couple of places, but this is the best piece for the technical linguistic complexity analyses that all of you are dying to read under conditions of insomnia at 3 in the morning when you have nothing else to do. But it is there for you. By the way, we did, to find out what external sources people used, if they used, we had quite interesting interview protocols with 32 Dutch players and 32 American players. I won't say anything else about this, but when you're doing empirical research, you need to know what you're doing empirical research on, right? So we wanted to know that what we were looking at and measuring was actually used, and every single one of these 64 players played the game, but also used external web resources while they were playing. All right, so they also had been playing quite a while. They'd been playing 3 or 4 times a week, oftentimes for 3 or 4 hours at a time. Do the math, that's 15 to 20 hours a week of gameplay, and these were just sort of typical gamers. So we looked at a number of different linguistic complexity methods to try and measure what was actually happening linguistically in these environments. So I'm not going to talk about readability, lexical sophistication, the mean segmental type token ratio, because those are all proxy measures for actual complexity, as many of you know. I'm rather looking at a measure of linguistic complexity that actually looks at and builds upon what we know about child language acquisition and the order of acquisition associated with syntactic structures. It's called the developmental level scale. Don't worry, this is pixelized. You're not supposed to read this, but it's 8 categories from 0 to 7. I don't know why they didn't start at 1, but it's 0 to 7. And each category up to 7 marks an increase in linguistic complexity. So we looked at quest text. As some of you may know already, for this game, a massively multiplayer game, all of your activity is driven by quests. You have to do things in the game. It's the way in which the game teaches. It creates conditions under which you are task-based and constrained and oriented, by the way. All games are learning environments, and they're actually designed very cleverly because if there isn't something to learn and something new and hard coming, then you won't continue paying the $15 a month. So these are developmental environments that are very interesting. And by the way, foreshadowing, you see that I'm talking about gameplay, but you also see there's another category in this embedded set of discourses, the metaplay, and then you even have artifacts or cultural artifacts associated with the playing of an online game. And we're just briefly going to run through this. Here's an example of a quest text. Again, all players read quests. And so we wondered, what is the nature of the linguistic complexity? So we took each sentence in these quest texts, and we dumped them into a bucket, and then modeled it. And what you can see is the average, this is a superordinate note for PhD students or people interested in methodology, the average was something like, D4.5 or something. Who cares about the average? What we discovered is you have a really large proportion of sentences that are super simple, and a very, very large proportion of sentences that are massively complex, right? The mean or the average doesn't really matter. So this is what we found. Unquestionably, extremely linguistically complex texts. So then we looked at all these strategy websites that students were using outside of the game, which are produced by players. So these are not produced by Blizzard Entertainment, which owns World of Warcraft. These are produced by players, for players, mostly related to how to deal with certain kinds of quests or strategies for running an instance or a dungeon in a 5-person team, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, the website at the bottom is now no longer existing, which is regrettable since it is my favorite website name ever, elitistjerks.com. So we looked at these websites which had been designated by players, and we found the same thing. So these are texts produced by players, teenagers, young adults, and they're helping each other by posting around strategy. Now you might say, okay, so linguistic complexity, and I know many linguists in the group here, linguistic complexity is only one measure of the value of a text. What about what's happening ideationally in these texts? And this is not my research, but Constance Steinkuhler, who's very well known in this area, has analyzed 2,000 posts to a World of Warcraft forum, and she found that in fact almost all, 80-some-odd%, were engaged in some kind of, as she describes it, knowledge construction. 50% included evidence of systems-based reasoning, and 10% is this precise model-based reasoning. I don't know how to do this. I will generate a hypothesis. I will test the hypothesis. If failure state, I will go back, generate new hypothesis, test the and again, this is what players are doing and reading for fun. This is recreation. Okay? So I found it very interesting that this was all happening. Now, the last piece here in the semiotic ecology of one kind of interesting, but one game, is this artifact piece, which is narratives, machinima, modding, art, all types of things happening in this space. I'll only talk about fandom. So again, these are people writing fan fiction about an online game that they play. 5 hours? I have 5 hours? Is that what that means? So I just got this hand, which I'm guessing has something to do with minutes. Yeah. I just want you to look at one thing here. You have a bunch of fan fictions that are posted. This is fanfiction.net. Look at the top one. Look at words. 92,000 words produced by this fan fiction author about action and interaction in the game. All right? I won't go through this in detail, but they're serviceable texts. They're obviously not publishable, but it's for the fan fiction community. And the interesting thing about this community is you also get feedback. So you get someone here, great beginning, great description, and then at the bottom, why don't you show us what the characters are doing? Draw us more into the action, by showing us what's happening rather than just third-person narration. Which, by the way, if you've taught creative writing, is exactly the kind of feedback that you provide. So it's a very complex semiotic ecology. It's interactive. There are all types of things happening outside of the game: strategy, website, scientific discourse, narrative and remix texts in the fan fiction variety, et cetera. Now, you may think, oh my gosh, this is not for me. This is too much. And I would only ask that you think about these. And I'm not suggesting anyone teach, German as a foreign language, World of Warcraft 101 or whatever. But the idea is this generosity of recognition. There is demonstrable evidence that things are happening in digital spaces volitionally chosen by students that are semiotically very complex, like writing a 100,000 word novel in a fan fiction community, and at the same time, as my colleague Eva Lam has described through ethnographic work with some of these participants, the student is failing high school English while also writing 100,000 words of relatively polished prose in an internet community they care about. So I ask you, where is the problem? I mean, is the problem, that the student loves writing so much in this environment? Is that the problem? So it's something we need to be thinking about. And as you're thinking about incorporating what's going on in these outside spaces, John Reinhardt and I have developed this model. You can take a day every 2 weeks or even a day a month. You say, hey, explore and collect texts associated with a community you're interested in, one that you really care about, right? So that's the onus on the student. Explore and analyze those texts with the help of the teacher. You might even learn something yourselves, of course, right? Because there's so many things happening in TikTok or in Instagram or Snapchat that we don't necessarily follow or know about. And resultantly, you can create and participate in these communities that you care about in the language you're trying to learn. And I am convinced and have evidence through other studies that this process of attending to students' desire lines is catalytic of high levels of engagement, which we know is associated with learning outcomes. All right? I'll jump over this. This is a little piece on criticality relating to surveillance capitalism and tying all this together. I know my time is very short. I will say I did not make up rewilding. You all made up rewilding. Rewilding is happening here in Europe. It's actually a funded set of projects. And my favorite rewilded area is in the Netherlands and Oostvaardersplassen. And the reason is it was under IJsselmeer. It was underwater until the 60s. They terraformed it, as the Dutch do. And then they tried to put in these older species, pre-Neolithic revolution, right? And they are trying to create an ecology in a constructed environment that was only terraformed 50 years ago. It's interesting. And they're trying to figure out what would a pre-Neolithic ecology look like. So no saber-toothed tigers yet, unfortunately. That would be really cool. So the idea of attending to desire lines, I've shown you this slide. Here is another slide. This is a university campus that I actually attended for a period. And you notice the path structure, and some of them look a little nonsensical. Why would you have these extra little paths? They did not pave anything. And they let students walk in the northwest of the US, wet grass all winter. And there were, not called by them, desire lines. You could see where people walked before you spent $1 million paving everything. Right? There were places where no one walked. Why would you want to pave that, right? So this is a really nice example of top-down and bottom-up approaches. This is a recent text that Sébastien Dubrel and I have published, Social Pedagogies, which is relevant to this idea. Here's a quick example of fan fiction and the pedagogical use of that. So you can see task types and, that by my colleague Shannon Sorrow. And the last piece, which is going to have to be like almost not presented or very briefly presented, is this locative media and spatial mobility. And I'm looking mostly at this idea of context or place-based learning. So this is just a little slide you're going to have to look at on your own time, which is much of the recent cognitive neuroscience research showing that cognition is not circuits of brain local activation, that cognition involves the body, and it also involves going to the store with a list of things you need to buy, right? And so literally you're externally outsourcing aspects of memory to a device. So the cognition quite literally flows between the device and your brain, and subsequently your embodied actions of purchasing something that you reminded yourself to get, or even got a text message while you were shopping from your partner, which is the case for me quite frequently. So we're familiar with these sorts of things, but Pokemon Go, any of you play Pokemon Go? Is it good here? Are there good Pokestops? Don't know. We've been developing a lot in this space. This is a quick example. I'll be super quick here, but this is from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where they actually are training journalists on a 1967 student protest of Dow Chemicals that made dangerous chemicals for combat in the Vietnam era. And so you actually go to the very physical spot where this protest happened, you watch the video, and then you play being a reporter, because you're in journalism school. We've been working with Native American communities, the Mojave, for example, also a game for Yupik. The Yupik language spoken in south and western parts of Alaska with an MA student that I co-advised, Natalie Cowley. And our work is this idea of discovery, social science, intervention research. We try and do a couple of things. Look at how language learning is happening, language use and language learning is happening when students take fairly typical language learning activities out of the classroom and do it in a position of high contextual relevance. So our design criteria here are hyper-intense contextualization of the language learning tasks, structured unpredictability, which comes from the gaming literature. You can control what happens in classroom contexts, but when students are wandering around in groups with guidance from a device that is location aware, there are all types of things that you can structure and support and scaffold, but there are also unpredictable aspects to that experience because it's happening organically out in the world, where, by the way, language lives. It also lives in classrooms, but it also lives out in the world. So we are exploring a whole bunch here, and don't get dizzy, but so we have the game in a number of languages. Here's an example of Japanese, French, and we intentionally, and this is a push for a lot of colleagues who do task-based language teaching, we intentionally under-specify the tasks, which means the students have to create or form in some way the task. They take a more agentive approach to doing this language learning activity than if it were just fully stipulated and carefully and narrowly defined for them. We actually do send players out with cameras on their heads so that we can gather data about what they're doing. And this is the discovery social science or second language acquisition piece of this. Some images people have taken. The game narrative is you come from the future, 2070, back to the present, because your future is totally environmentally degraded and destroyed. So you have to discover green technologies that could yet save your planet. That's the game narrative. So sorry for going so quickly here. But we familiarize, we send them out, they do in-class debriefing, and then activities from debates to presentations to other kinds of things to incorporate this out-of-class activity, this rewilding activity, back into the classroom context. We've asked a number of research questions which don't sound, we'll be finishing right, that don't sound very second language acquisition-y, but that's because the smartphone, in terms of wide adoption, is only 10 years old. We still don't truly understand how people orient when they're in groups and a device is present to spatial navigation, to movement. And so we actually have a number of projects that look at this. So here are the articles that you can look at on your own time. And the last thing I'll say, and I promise, this is it. So anyone thinking, wow, this was a huge amount of information, there are three things that I want us to think about. Technologies that improve business as usual, right? That amplify or make something we already do better. I would like us to be thinking about that. I think Deadmar Muir's project is like that. It's something that already existed, make it digital, add feedback, iterative improvement, incredibly important, right? But we also have a number of opportunities to radically transform what happens in terms of learning trajectories that can be catalyzed within institutions like universities. Vielen Dank. Sorry.